Top diplomats from the US and Russia are preparing to hold talks about ending the war in Ukraine. But there are concerns in Ukraine that the Trump administration's plans would mean permanently giving up territory seized by Russia since 2014. At the same time, European leaders are holding an emergency summit in Paris, as the UK says it is now ready to deploy peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Zoya Sheftalovich, contributing editor for POLITICO, says it's clear that the US is taking a unilateral approach towards the conflict.
There is this feeling that the US under Donald Trump has effectively just decided to cut out all other parties and allies from these negotiations and deal directly with Russia. There is this feeling that the idea that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine has completely been ignored by the Trump administration.
So what can we expect in Saudi Arabia and talks that will be led by the new US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio?
We don't really know. We don't know who from the Russian side is coming, though there have been strong indications that Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, may attend. We don't know what sorts of concessions may be offered. We don't know what the Europeans might have to do in the wake of this, whether they may need to send peacekeeping troops of their own into Ukraine. These are all unknowns, and certainly the European side is very nervous about what might be agreed on their behalf, as is Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky did not even know that the Saudi talks were going to happen until Politico broke the story over the weekend during the Munich Security Conference. He was bemused at the fact that apparently the Americans were going to have negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, and he himself said he had not heard about these talks and did not know that they were happening. So certainly there is chaos and confusion as to what might occur in Riyadh.
And is there already an indication of what might occur in Saudi Arabia, given what we saw last week with what Pete Hegseth and the US President Donald Trump had to say about Ukraine eventually having to concede land that it had pre-war, and also that it had to relinquish its ambitions to join NATO?
That is the indication of what the Trump administration has been pushing for. Though that said, after those comments were made by Pete Hegseth, Trump himself walked some of that back and said something entirely different. So the problem with the Trump administration is that you never know what you're going to get, and nothing is final until it's final, and even then it can change. But certainly the Ukrainians are steeling themselves for having to swallow a very bitter pill when it comes to pre-2014 borders. Of course, the Russians have taken territory since they launched their full-scale invasion in 2022, but there was also territory lost during the original invasion in 2014. And what Ukraine has said from the very outset of this war and from the very outset of talks about negotiating a peace deal is that it will never accept ceding its territory to Russia. The Russians want to keep all of the territory that they've gained, and potentially they may want more. So it is really a question of what Trump and his envoys in Riyadh will decide, and whether the Ukrainians can stomach some of those concessions. On NATO, again, Trump has said that there's no way that he will allow Ukraine to join NATO. The European partners, European allies have said that they disagree and that there needs to be some path toward NATO membership as the only way to secure Ukraine in the future. Something that the Europeans are concerned about and that Ukraine is concerned about is that any sort of ceasefire now with any kind of concession when it comes to the size of Ukraine's military forces and when it comes to NATO will mean that an emboldened Putin will come back to finish the job later on once he has regrouped. And that is something that is very concerning to Europe.
Yes, and on Europe, it seems that the continent is clearly formulating its own response to Donald Trump's plans for Ukraine. And there is, of course, an emergency meeting of leaders. What's likely to happen on that front?
So there's a small number of European leaders. It's not all 27 EU leaders that are meeting in Paris. It is a sub-selection of those leaders, including some of the heavy hitters, such as the French president, the German chancellor, the UK prime minister, who is no longer in the bloc but is still a close ally. They're going to be meeting today in Paris and discussing what it is they can do. Part of what this meeting is to discuss is a questionnaire that was sent by the Trump administration to European countries in which the Trump administration essentially asked, what are you planning to do to guarantee peace in Ukraine? once the peace talks are done, including are you willing to send peacekeepers to Ukraine to secure borders? That is probably going to be the top topic of conversation in Paris today, particularly with Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, having last night flagged in an opinion piece that he wrote in The Telegraph in London that the UK was open to sending peacekeepers. He has made that clear that the UK is on board. Emmanuel Macron of France has also said that he is open to that. The question is whether others will also join in this endeavor. It is definitely something that Ukraine has been calling for, and it's something that Trump has said is necessary. He said he would not be sending US troops on the ground to Ukraine, so that the Europeans would have to pick up on that task. So that is really going to be, we expect, the top topic of conversation, as will be defense spending. We know that Trump has called on EU allies to up their defense spending to 5% of GDP. That's something that's going to be very difficult for some of the countries involved because of debt problems that they've got at home. So that's going to be a big topic of discussion, how and to what extent they plan on raising their defense spending.
And more broadly speaking, as far as Volodymyr Zelensky is concerned, is the Ukrainian president now facing a clear choice between a US-Russia plan versus a European one?
I think it is not really a choice that the Ukrainian president will have. I think ultimately the US-Russia plan will be the plan that gets put on the table. European allies are finding themselves to some extent sidelined in these talks. That said, there is going to be a choice for Zelensky in terms of whether he accepts the plan that is put on the table or likely to be put on the table by the Trump administration in negotiations with Russia, as well as later down the track we have been assured with Ukraine, or whether he decides to continue fighting and not sign those that peace negotiation, not sign the agreement. That is going to be a key question for him, whether he is able to sell that sort of plan at home and the extent to which Ukraine can keep fighting without American help, particularly the question of to what extent European allies will continue supporting Ukraine if Zelensky says no to a US-brokered peace deal.
Okay, Zoya Sheftalovich, appreciate your analysis as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.